Well, my role here, and I came last year, is to quickly and as best I can discuss some of the funding issues related to folks who fund people who are pushing policies that many folks here disagree with one way or the other. And basically, I did a little paper last year with Ryan Ballas of National Center for Public Policy Research. Most of the numbers are still pretty good. However, I also included an updated top 20 smart growth grants, which are self-identified using foundation-related software. And this is basically just to give you guys a gross sort of idea of what kind of go ahead. What kind of monies are coming from the institutional philanthropy world to push smart growth policies and other, land use and regulatory takings and such. And the big news that I have for you guys here today, and our speakers earlier today, especially during lunch, speaking about the use of the climate change issue as the premier regulatory issue to create comprehensive growth and comprehensive land use planning sort of regulatory structures. If you go to this page that has the nice green bar up on the top, I'm just going to give you guys a nice rundown of this. This is from a document that came out in August from the Design to Win Coalition. And I'll give you the disclaimer, even though I don't necessarily buy into it. The views of this document are not are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the scientific advisors or the funders. And the scientific advisors and the funders.
Page 44?
Yes, it's page 44. It doesn't actually say that on there, but I'm reading for you the disclosure from.
Oh, okay.
And basically, the funders of this project wish to remove 36 gigaton of CO2 between now and 2050, and between now and 2030, under their what they see as the philanthropic needs, they assume that they can find 11 million gigaton from basically the industrialized world, primarily in the United States, because the Change to Win coalition is primarily United States based. And basically, if you look from the estimated need to current investment structure, the ramp up is enormous. They argue that they currently spend only $200 million a year on the issue one way or the other, and that they need to spend anywhere between $800 million to $1 billion a year. And we're talking from now until 2010 to push the policies that they think can remove the 11 gigatons that they see as being most harmful between now. They're very, very set on the notion that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere cannot go past 450 parts per million. And I'll let Joel or someone else explain, the ramifications or the different scientific arguments behind that. However, what's important for the discussion here is basically if you zoom in on that transportation and that building sector, if you draw a circle around there versus how much they say they want to spend versus what they're spending, and then you go into the deep annexes of the document and say, well, what exactly are we talking about as far as when we're talking about building, and what are we talking about when we're talking about transportation? And we're basically talking about the implementation of all of the policies that we are discussing as being bad for homeowners, bad for mobility, and bad for property rights. And real quickly, I'm just going to go down, and I think I let Leroy take a look, Leonard take a look through this earlier, and he said he might have been vomiting in his throat from seeing some of the top priorities here. And basically, it's anything from, pay-as-you-go driving to various financial incentives for mass transit, and individual incentives to what you name it. And we're also talking about comprehensive CO2 regulatory structures at the federal level. I brought a couple of papers from a paper we did recently discussing some of the folks who were involved in this on the foundation side. But at the end of the day, the amount of cash that's going into most of the usual suspects for activists, people at the local level, state level. Some folks in here might know Paul Chester down at the John Locke Foundation, who's been following a group called Center for Climate Strategies, and they go state to state pushing state-based carbon control plans, and basically they offer the governors that they're going to do this for free for them, and it's all backed by the usual suspects in the foundation world, and then they can get in and say now South Carolina has a climate control policy, and the governor gets to say they did all this great work and gets a lot of press out of it, but in reality they didn't actually have to do anything, and there's no economic considerations that are ever taken into the panel discussion. And off the top of my head, I won't go completely into that because Paul's done so much great work that I can just really refer you to all his work down at the Locke Foundation and following that story. If anyone has any questions as far as what this means, I mean but that was really why I came here, is to let folks know that they think they're only spending $200 million a year, and if you look, according to the Chronicles, they're raising $6.6 billion a year. And granted, that's not all towards specific climate change and policy issues, but if they want to spend an extra $800 million a year, we're looking at a heck of a fight coming down through the next 3-4 years. Yeah.
Okay. In Madison, we keep having this mandatory use of compact fluorescent bulbs. It keeps coming up as a mandate because of the CO2 emissions, and especially from coal-fired power plants, which is, we have a lot of that. I mean, and we also have this group that's sort of lingering in the background called the progressive majority. And it somehow, I mean, I hate to think of, it's like this sinister thing that's going on that seems to be permeating so many policies. And can you follow these?
Well, I mean, just to elaborate a small amount, within the last 3.5-4 years, there's been a lot more activity at the state level, especially within the Mountain West and in the Midwest. There has been rumors that there are some of the folks that have been funding, that are involved in the Democracy Alliance. I don't know if anyone knows anything about the Democracy Alliance. That's the folks who are organizing the institutional funding of the left, trying to rebuild the idea of the Heritage and all the other players on the right, trying to have the left do that with Center for American Progress and such. Well, they've made a huge push within the Intermountain West and Wisconsin, for example, and a lot of these new groups that all of a sudden just popped up, that's generally, that's a good place to start looking as far as who's funding and who's.
Because it really has, in the past 2 years, I'd say, has really become much more dominant. I mean, they're taking a role in all the labor. I mean, it's always been a big labor town anyway, but it's sort of multiplied.
No, it's the idea that you have a grant that becomes a force multiplier, where then you have 6 feet on the ground that are working on that issue every day instead of 2 or 3, and then they're just more present everywhere.
You call the TV stations, take 6 of those bulbs, smash them on the floor, and get the hazmat people to clean them up, because they have to by law, and you'll get something. Steve Malloy, John Stein.
We beat it back once, but it's coming again.
I just wanted to touch on one thing that was on the list of policy recommendations that we touched on there. There is one that I want to make sure that conceptually you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because he said pay-as-you-go systems, and if you read what's in that document, it talks about things like market pricing and transportation, tolling, dynamic pricing, pay-as-you-go, BMP-based systems. Those are good ideas that are being co-opted here for really probably the purposes of generating funds to put into mass transit. So let's just be clear on that particular front. I mean, the rest of the list I think is pretty self-evident.
This is a lot of what Mark was talking about today about being source neutral versus one way or the other.
This is another example of it as well. If you take the issue of light bulbs, this is happening in the UK. They're talking about everybody having to have energy efficient light bulbs. At the same time as they're arguing for higher energy taxes. I don't agree with the theoretical argument for energy taxes because you've got the problem of the government doesn't know what the price is. But even if you accept the argument that the government does know the price, if it sets the energy tax to make energy prices higher, then there is no need to worry on economic theory grounds about having a regulation, because the argument is you've given people an incentive to consider the cost of using high energy bulbs, and they'll substitute at the margin. They'll switch voluntarily. Not all of them, but some of them will switch, reducing energy demand. These people are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to say you introduce taxes, but then if there are still a few people consuming, you then ban them from doing it as well. Which is, there's no theoretical basis to these kind of arguments. It's ultimately an illiberal idea that you think people should be doing this, and we're going to do anything we can to make you behave in this particular way.
Well, and the one way I've been looking at how this affects energy policy, because that's something more that, as far as environmental groups and what I look at CRC at Greenwatch, and something that's been really striking is, I think recently within the last 4 or 5 weeks, the Sierra Club and all their friends' victory in Kansas over some coal-fired power plant expansion. And what actually happened was there was a attempt by the group that was financing the expansion to also add in ethanol boilers and other sort of biofuel structures, and saying, hey, this is going to be an extra efficient sort of development, and we're going to be promoting ethanol and local use of biofuels, and it still failed. And the Sierra Club still got their way. And how much more electricity? And the idea is to push the idea of an element of energy poverty through constraint. And that's the direction that we're going to go, especially if they can't even pass something like that in Kansas when it's attached to the ethanol lobby.
We have the same issue in Atlanta. We're under a drought watch right now. We have a water crisis. And what's happening there is that the environmentalists are attaching their agenda to the water crisis. So now they're talking about growth management. They're talking about but growth management, but not adding reservoirs, not adding capacity in any way. They're talking about mandating low flow fixtures in resales. They're talking, and they're talking about banning interbasin transfers. And these are all anti-growth measures. This is not handling any water crisis, which is in fact caused by the drought and by their lack of foresight in the beginning. So this is how, and the other thing is property, the property rights issue comes up again, where so many homes in Georgia, it's a sprawling state, so many of the homes are on septic systems. They're trying to ban septic systems instead of requiring better oversight,
right.
The maintenance of septic systems, they're trying an outright ban. And so that what happens in that case is you who bought that mountain property can't build your cabin anymore because you can't put your septic system out there with it.
And they won't allow an urban service area to go out to there either, I'm sure.
So,
Absolutely, but that's kind of the general.
The environmental message into a property right.
Sure, and as soon as the drought came up, I knew that was going to be the first thing on their agenda, was to cloak everything that they've been wanting for decades into the the reason there's no water is because there's no.
The government is not helping at all because they're creating the crisis as their PR issue now. We only have 3 months of water left in Atlanta. How innovative is a population? Under all circumstances, you find ways to work on these things and solve them. I mean, we're not going to sit there until the lakes are dry, the reservoirs are dry. But
you couldn't get it from Florida.
that's politicians for you.
Well, as I was telling Benita earlier in the day, though, there was a couple of really good critiques of the water authorization bill that recently passed on a lot of environmental websites and basically saying why the veto was a good veto coming from a an environmental perspective. And after reading it, I just had to say, you don't have to be an environmentalist to know that the Corps is mismanaged and does a pretty horrible job, no matter how you slice it. And I've known that from being 7 years old up on Lake Lanier. I mean, you don't have to be an environmentalist in the extreme to realize that the Corps does a pretty horrible job.
Is this 200 million? How does this money get into the election next year? I mean, is it incremental? Is it the same 200 million? I mean,
it really depends, and I'm just using their numbers and their assessment of their efforts, just kind of as a gauge. I mean, who knows how effective that. I mean, as far as the Chronicle of Philanthropy is concerned, environmental groups have raised $6.6 billion in 2006. But what does that go to? Is that buying a piece of property in Nature Conservancy or Nature Conservancy doing something else? I mean, it really depends, and that's why in this largest 20 smart growth grants, or the $34 million over 6 years, and 500 grants, and those are only self-identified grants. So the idea, what I was just trying to say is that that 35 million, that's just self-identified. I mean, how much more towards that 6.6 was raised on the basis of smart growth, and how much was actually used to fight, their policies, and how much wasn't? And how much is in the reserve, and how much new money are they going to get a hold of to increase to this $800 to $1 billion a year sort of outreach effort?
Do we have a list like this on our side? I mean, do we know how much? I mean, in terms of, I mean, what's our resource amount to fight this kind of stuff? Do we have any
Who's we?
idea?
That's the question.
Who's us?
Yeah, who's us?
We would be happy with 1/100.
Who's us?
I don't have any idea.
And we would
I
win.
can't define us.
Yes,
I'm still
exactly.
confused. Next few days, I don't know who us is yet. Who is us? No, I mean, seriously, who is us? I mean, who's we?
Well,
I don't know if it, I
mean,
You're
all
looking at it.
Yeah. I mean,
Oh, so it's a pretty small group then. It's not, I mean, it's not aligned to a party specifically, is it?
No, it's just various groups that, I mean,
Okay.
Cato, Reason.
So the answer is very little, basically.
The Heritage, it's a small group, but we're just a small.
But my point was,
We will win.
my point was of the of those who understand the economics of this from our perspective and our local activists or the grassroots. I mean, I don't think it's going to add up to 35 million over from 99 to 2005. So I'm sure it would be less than 2 if you really did the math. But that's just kind of back of the hand sort of.
You would think it would be much more.
Speaking of who, you go ahead.
I think one measure of how bad things got was when the editor of Science magazine, a month or 2 ago, had an editorial titled "Game's Over" on the global warming issue, on the CO2 hypothesis, which goes, I think, significantly beyond what scientific credibility is about.
Science lost it 6 years ago.
But I think Mark is absolutely right. My own view is it is a terrible mistake to be back there arguing against the concept. What we need to be doing is structuring the response, however stupid it is, in the least economically destructive ways.
Can I just say as well, I don't think you need actually very many people to change public attitudes on these things. It's a matter of anticipating. Like, you can almost predict, it seems to me, when there's a drought or anything like that, what these people are going to do. And you have to have your strategy in place. You have to be able to use their arguments, and it just means getting a few people, I think, into media positions, and I know that isn't always easy. But you can just have those people so that whenever the argument is made, there's a response there. Too often, I mean, I've had the misfortune to be watching CNN on a number of occasions this week, and there's simply no response given.
Well, they don't want
There's
to
only one point of view comes over.
You have to switch channels to Fox to get the response.
I mean,
Well, or you could take it one step further and have watched any of the Green is Universal programming on any of the the GE Universal channels, and have the most extreme of the green message embedded into I don't know, nighttime content of you're watching the Vegas show and, hey, I don't know, I might want to spend some money on some carbon credits tonight. It's not even funny. It's not even interesting. Just one side note. I just wanted everyone to take a look and enjoy our piece on the Certina Foundation, which, for an example of a foundation that's heavily involved in funding this discussion on the other side, and how it came about from a gentleman who made a lot of money in real estate and resources. So I thought that's basically our smart growth article for this year, and we'll have another one coming out next year.